Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. I am sick again, and therefore I will probably not actually be talking that much. But I figured we haven't had any commentary on our streams in a while, and therefore I should probably make at least an appearance. We do have a few things to talk about, depending on who joins. But you can generally assume that if you see team members playing, people that you're mostly used to, then you probably won't hear much from me until someone else specific, or rather more specific, joins the lounge. Of course, because the lounge is at the moment kind of quiet, feel free to jump on in. This is a 3 rounds, first to 2, character select on lobby today. And as always, if you are anywhere on the rim of the Atlantic Ocean or have decently good internet connection and you're a little beyond that, Midwestern US, certain parts of Europe, the Caribbean, etc., you can at least give it a try. You may have differing levels of connection to different members, but we'll definitely accommodate you if the lounge is not too full. Overall, therefore, you can expect to see the standard, both in terms of plans and operations today. Though we will be short one player, and might get OmniRabbit joining later for at least a short time, maybe. If you've been looking out for our other content, we'll probably have something ready for King of Fighters soon enough. But King of Fighters isn't a game where you need a lot of bots to figure out what's going on. That said, we still have some work done. We are just trying to make sure that these could be input reasonably because their recording system is a little bit different. And since it doesn't save inputs anyway, we do have to make sure that they are within the realm of things you could input quickly just for training purposes. Which is of course why it's taken basically a month to get that far. There's a lot of stuff that you need to be able to see people doing. Unlike Street Fighter, where things are a little more curated, you can expect that specific combos and specific strategies are going to be used for specific characters. King of Fighters, even though 15 is not terribly universal compared to others, still has a lot of stuff where you more so need to deal with specific smaller things, and we were therefore waiting to see what other tricks people might have. Basically the idea of a character for whom a certain thing that is just normal and you learn to defend it against everyone. For some reason for this character it's more of a mix-up, or you might not be able to easily identify what's happening. Those sorts of things were probably the most important, and we haven't actually seen that many of them. So watching, basically at the moment it seems as if there's not a lot of need for KOF bots if you are familiar with fighter ones. And there's some that you could just probably either come up with yourself if you are a bot user, or just try whatever is bothering you. You probably have enough experience. If you don't, of course, and you are only a KOF player, don't have any Street Fighter experience one way or the other, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to be watching this stream, but we'll see what happens when our eventual KOF streams start appearing. As for now though, as noted, jump on into this 3 rounds first to 2 lounge if you want to get some games in, and I'll possibly be back later on in the stream. You'll notice because either a Platinum Ryu, a Master Luke, probably? I think it's Master, right? Or a Guile that I don't know their current rank. So if you see any of those 3, then I'll probably be back on to have something to say. And beyond that, you might be stuck with the same old quiet for a while longer.
Round two. Fight. You win. It's go time. Let's do this. Kanzuki. Nekali.
See you, Tim.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight. Final round. Fight! You lose. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You win! Round one. Fight! Win. It's go time. Let's do this. Green Kanzuki.
Instant kill.
Not actually who I expected, but that's on me, because I believe we have seen Mallow before, and I am honestly apologizing that I forgot about them. This is a matchup that has been hard for our Karine in the past because Ed's movement is so hard to track relative to her buttons. And if the player is good enough at footsies and don't really need to play it all that hard, Karine ends up very encouraged to hit buttons because Ed is hitting buttons. And that's not a great way for this to go. Because Ed has more range than Karine by a little bit. So, there's nothing specific here that I would have as advice for either player. Our Platinum Ed certainly knows what they're doing, at least in terms of how much they can mentally control the matchup. And we're not going to see much change until an evolution from our Karine side. But there isn't a specific evolution that she can have either. It's probably learning to ignore the fact that Ed is hitting buttons. The easiest way to think about this is, many characters who hit buttons in neutral also have moves that will make you advance, even if it's only very slightly, so the ranges change a little bit. Ed is not that character. Ed basically doesn't change his ranges without committing to something, and as a result, if you see Ed just hitting buttons in neutral and you're not being hit by those buttons, you can mostly relax. I'm not saying you should play defensively and wait for Ed to do things, but you can definitely relax. And relaxing is probably the important part here. We've been talking a lot about the psychological aspects of this game, because they're really the thing that separates the stronger players from those who feel like they're strong but are mostly repetitive. Understanding the space where you can stand for a given character, understanding when to attack or stop attacking, all of these things are really important, but they're mostly psychological effects. The rest of it is skills that you could just train back and forth all the rest of the time. That, for example. When you see your opponent wiggle like that, your best bet is actually to backdash, because chances are they're going to go for a low medium or a throw, or they're just trying to bait you. Some people are good at wiggling into actual raw Oki, but most people can't do it. At least they can't do it consistently enough that you shouldn't just backdash a lot of the time. If you are a Karine player, you often don't get knocked down in ways that are going to lead to really bad setups or situations anyway, because generally characters in this game that have good knockdowns have them under very specific conditions that Karine tends to negate, so you're able to do a lot more there. You can see, for example, that getting hit by either jumping or attempting the backdash with the medium isn't necessarily that terrible. This for example, is a similar situation. There's not a lot to be worried about here. But because Ed's dash is so good, there are situations in which you should probably watch your step more. Being prepared to block is better than being prepared to try to check Ed, since he's fast enough that you probably aren't going to react with a check, and a lot of the time he'll trick you if you do. So, we're seeing definitely intense play from both sides. And our Karine has definitely learned to reduce the amount of time she spends thinking about what's going to happen, and is now working on not being stressed when something unexpected does happen, like that, for example. It is good as an Ed player to sometimes just raw EX uppercut in neutral, because your opponent is, one, not expecting it, and two, usually not going to do a lot of damage to you if they weren't, as it's such an easy move for you to throw out on reaction to a ton of things. There's nothing to input. You just hit the buttons. In certain cases, you hit literally one button, depending on how you set up your stuff, and go. And because of the way that those things start, if you're expecting a hit, then you uppercut. And if you weren't expecting a hit, then you didn't need to do anything. I think this player doesn't usually actually accept their matches, or maybe I'm missing the name. Well, I guess they're taking them today.
Let's do this.
I may be confusing this player with a different Zangief, but I don't think so. We can't necessarily say that we have regulars for stream other than the ones I mentioned, but we do see different people come and go at different times. And I generally have a good memory for people and sometimes even their playstyles. That said, it might be that this player sometimes plays and is sometimes AFK, and that's why this happens. I do remember that they're Zero Beast tier, but again, I could be confusing that with someone else. I'm not expecting this to be terribly favored toward Mallow though, basically. Fortunately for Mallow, Ed is pretty good at dealing with Zangief's various methods because Ed is a good dash-in style character with easy ranged defense. Basically, Ed can stay just outside Zangief's better ranges and just do stuff. Zangief probably should hit medium kick a lot in this scenario and be ready to lariat because Ed should sometimes jump. And the medium kick is a good way to deal with other stuff that's going on. The medium kick also has enough range to create the scenario you just saw, whereas Zangief is the one that gets to do the dash. Because of the long startup on certain things Ed does, and the way that Ed generally flows in close range, you're not necessarily going to take that much damage if you do in fact just dash up. He's either going to go all the way over your head and not deal that much damage, or probably you will manage to get a jab off before he has anything seriously damaging against you. That's the core point of this bit. Zangief has enough health to get through a lot of this. To take the occasional risk and think, okay, I can do that, for example. The situation was set up, it would probably have been much worse for a different character, but not many people can both get crossed up and hit the opponent in a trade consistently enough to go, yes, this is part of my strategy. That was good. Put him back in the corner. You see also, of course, the choice of the V skill too, which helps even more for similar reasons. You don't really need the medium kick only if you have this option as well. The problem is, as you saw it there, it's a little bit harder to do the same sorts of things because there's more of a telegraph and Ed can jump out of more things. But the main reason is that because it's a telegraph, the medium kick is a matter of I'm walking forward now and then I'm going to hit a button. Or maybe I won't hit a button and you should not hit anything of your own. It keeps Ed moving and not thinking in terms of I'm going to counter this, I'm going to whiff punish this. You can whiff punish Zangief's stand medium kick, but with Ed you don't tend to get too much damage off doing so. You can, however, whiff punish his V skill too.
Fight.
Oof. Ed players the world over have my sympathy for just how beatable Psycho Spark startup is. They're still missing it at the moment, and there's the problem. Ed is slightly too fast for this to work as a defensive measure, which means you have to use it offensively, which means again, you can be whiff punished. The heavy kick and the sweep are capable of doing things, but they don't necessarily set up the situation you're better off with. If you're familiar with Zangief's stand medium kick, you probably have an idea of why I'm suggesting it. Fortunately, Zangief doesn't always get crossed up by Ed's stuff if positioned correctly, so there are at least some options for I'm pushing on you now. Still, reacting to that dash, especially with the flows that Mallow is using, probably not going to be easy enough. This time it got jumped. But a good flow from both sides, and a really good demonstration of what happens when you understand the matchup, but are missing one key component. Usually it's the first or the second layer, depending on what type of opponent you're facing. But just missing that one button can make the spacings of the match and the flow of the match all go in ways that end up being frustrating. Not because you couldn't stand up to them, not because you couldn't have won, but because it always feels like you're falling a little short. You're going a little bit too much into your opponent's rhythm and pace.
Let's do this.
This is another matchup where missing just one button is problematic, and this is true on both sides. In order to deal with Nakali really well most of the time, Ed needs to really specifically space stand heavy punch. And similarly, in order for Nakali to be effective, the light kick is basically paramount. You are fast enough in neutral walking to hit the light kick for no reason, and Ed basically can't whiff punish Nakali's light kick. In fact, the two moves interact with each other. That's the way the matchup tends to go. If you use the light kick, then Ed must use the heavy punch, and vice versa. If you use the light kick enough, then technically Ed not only has to use the heavy punch, but he will get into positions where it's better to use the heavy punch than anything else, but those positions make the rest of the match better for Nakali. So your goal isn't, oh, I'm going to hit you with this light kick. Your goal is, I'm going to make you miserable with this light kick until I can do more things. And, thankfully, our Nakali player is pretty, let's call it naturally Nakali, and therefore more likely to do things that will complement the use of the light kick. For example, that was relatively good with one thing going wrong. Laura plays this matchup relatively similarly. It's pretty much just, hey, I'm hitting light kick to stop you from dashing at me. I'm going to block before most of your moves go off if you try to do anything else. And then we're going to have an actual close-up match. The other main thing Necalli needs to be able to do is get through the charged V skill, which honestly is relatively hard. If you recognize it early enough, you can jump. If you recognize it too late, you often have to block and then risk the uppercut, and similar things.
Ed wins.
But you will note that overall, the matches got more so explosive. And this often happens because the player decided, okay, I know that you're going to use this strategy. I don't like the rhythm of the fight that I get when you're using this strategy, so I'm going to play more aggressively and see if your defense is good enough, for example. And that might be itself enough to shift the match. So we are probably going to see some difficulties from the Wolf side in that defending from the jumps and getting the correct responses to the pressure are probably going to make more of a difference in this than much else. This would be one of those situations where one would have to make sure to play cleanly enough to just not get knocked down too often. However, with V skill 2 active, you could get fairly far into this if you could manage to last long enough without using the V reversal. Because Ed is relatively weak to Necalli's V trigger too. Not super weak, but weak enough in specific ways of playing that you have to worry about it. It is a slow moving shield in front against a character that basically attacks from the front. So any situation in which you can get to that is good. Getting out of the pressure though is costly without the V reversal available. So I wouldn't necessarily say I know one way or the other what should be done. But here we have the chance to activate, and with that activation comes some stress on Ed's side. Like, not a lot of stress, but enough that you can already see that our Ed player is basically going a little bit more rough than they would normally go, because they kind of have to. That was perfectly spaced, and therefore probably not something the Wolf could have gotten away from. A neutral jump wouldn't have helped. There weren't probably any other moves that could be done. I think that spacing even the uppercut will whiff. So, good job from Mallow there. Literally perfect crouch medium kick spacing after the dash. And I'm not really sure there was anything else that could be done. So still good on both sides, and we are seeing therefore more and more those tiny moments of recognizing that you have enough time to do something and then doing it. That is mostly the core of what it takes to deal with Platinum players. We've had discussions in the past about what it takes to help you get past players of a certain tier consistently. That's obviously shifted somewhat as people have become better and better at the game. But it still holds true a lot of the time because the skill types involved don't really shift that much. Now we see a change to Guile, but I'm not expecting too much difference here. The main thing lost is the dashing medium kick crouch. So there's less worry about what neutral looks like in terms of dashes, and more worry about what neutral looks like in terms of missed spaced attacks. But since Guile is a character that you don't really have to attack for long periods, you don't have to worry as much about it. In fact, most of the time, you don't really want to chase Guile to the corner if you don't have to, because then he will get you in the corner somehow. And while he's not necessarily a terror there compared to some characters, it is troublesome enough that you don't want to do it a lot of the time. It's a little dry, but honestly, a lot of the time if you're facing off with a Guile player and they retreat immediately, your best bet is to leave them there. Like, just leave them all together and, let's say, waste a certain amount of the round before even fighting actually starts. Because while Guile will build up meter by just throwing booms at you, many characters have lots of good ways around this, especially from the other side of the screen. Kareen in particular can get to full screen and Mayokin through most booms. The way that those things get stopped is for Guile to actually use the meter that the booms are giving, and all the while, Kareen is building up the meter of her own. This is actually something really important that you don't often see as a core concept, except at maximum pro level play. The simple idea that you do in fact build up enough V meter from just blocking projectiles that if you had a way to use your V trigger to rapidly win a match, you are often better off just blocking them. If you have a V skill that can sometimes stop them, but you might fail, it's, again, often in your best interest to just try this anyway, because the way that you will get through the match, if you have a plan relative to your V trigger, is just do that. There's nothing more to it. And as a result of that, we are seeing somewhat more aggressive play anyway. It is very important to learn when you are going to end up having to switch because your opponent is realized, oh, I can't actually beat you by just defending and wait for you to mess up, so I'm coming in. If you feel as if you don't get this experience often enough, remember to spend more time trying to force the opponent to do it. It's not always the most fun thing to be doing with your time, but it can still get you through a lot. In this case, for example, in order for Guile to do this, Guile has to stand and jump at the range where the deep kick doesn't help, and Kareen can actually just air to air without worrying as much. The times the deep kick does work, I can't say you'll recognize it every time, but your chances of coming out of that situation in a better place are higher than the other way around. Guile is one of those characters against whom you have to find the spot for your raw activation, and that's often difficult, but remember not to try to do it too much very close range, or you might find yourself in problems for some other reasons, namely the sort of opponent who will either throw or EX flash kick out of those situations. Guile players know that they can sit around and have enough defense to deal with the situation anyway, so they're just fine, they'll live with it. One thing that makes Kareen's life a little easier is that if she does choose the skill to, it's a little quicker to get the meter, to get through the booms, get through this situation, but it's not necessarily easier. It's about the same. The main thing you're dealing with here as a problem is that if you are using the full screen Mayokin method, your opponent is free to use their own B skill, and you obviously can't deal with it that way. But you will see that the result is still the same. There was a lot of boom usage there, a lot of meter usage there, so you didn't have to worry as much about the, okay, I have a life lead, but I'm still going to get deleted any old time. From the Guile side, the answer is usually to spend as much time as you can setting up your perfect jump arc, because Kareen does not anti-air particularly well, to the point where she will whiff entirely against Guile's optimal jump arc, both if she uses her standard anti-air and her EX anti-air. So you can, if Kareen will let you, throw enough booms to put her in a position where you can jump, and then obviously the option would be there for you. You don't always have to jump, you could just throw more booms. But the hard part is remembering when you throw the boom, take the step so that you could jump perfectly if you wanted to. Your opponent might neutral jump over your Sonic Boom, for example, and this is actually usually a really good time to get that jump spacing set up, and sometimes to even jump before they even get fully back onto the ground. Once Guile is within that range, he has a very, very slight advantage in footsies, even against Karine, because her moves are more so meant to control space in front of her, and she doesn't have as many moves similar to Chun-Li's stuff, for example, where you just take up a very small space and wait for your opponent to basically punch their way or kick their way into it and die. Nor does she have instant long reach to resolve the problem in any other way. I'm not saying this is a situation in which I definitely suggest using V skill to, but this is definitely the sort of opponent because, as you've probably seen, you don't really need the V skill one for the Ed matchup either. The main issue being that this would mess up all of Unsiren's combos of a specific type and therefore be kind of stressful. Still, if she's not terribly trying to win all that hard today, at least win in the sense of beating this opponent and therefore getting to play more. If the aim is to win the other way, like gaining knowledge, gaining experience, then probably today is a V skill 2 day if she can remember to change it, simply because there's more that can be learned from fighting Mallow with that, probably on any character. We've mentioned this before as well. A player is often going to have the same sorts of style, regardless of what character they're playing, at least to a point. There are players, of course, who explicitly develop the opposite halves of their style for the 2 characters they play, or sometimes 3 characters they play. But understand that most of the time, if someone is jumping into your stuff, that's not the reason.
Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! Final round. Fight!
I didn't have as much to say about that matchup because I had to watch and see what our Zangief would come up with. Playing that with that V skill is quite hard because you can't use your V skill to rapidly gain V meter the way you can with V skill 1, which means that your plan would have to be figuring out a way through booms anyway. But because the main way through booms is in fact to headbutt them and then jump, you don't really end up getting close to Guile. You can definitely walk him down to some extent. You can definitely get moments where you flip in and get some sort of hit. But he has good enough defense that Zangief's struggle to deal with that spacing is real. The best thing you can usually do is to get Guile to not throw the boom at all, and it's really difficult to do that with the skill 2 active, I feel. It's just a matter of timings, really. Necalli has a similar problem, actually, because Necalli can go through booms, but he can only go through single ones. He can duck under booms, but he can't make his way in the same way. The position doesn't work as well. Oh, they go away. Oh no, they're there. They're alive. I mean, where it happened probably on one side. This situation, though, is one that Necalli actually has an answer for. When Guile is at this range, you can in fact just use Stomp. A lot of the time you get hit anyway, but the times that you do land the Stomp, especially EX Stomp, it saves you from most of the rest of the situation. You're gonna probably get hit by the booms regardless, so don't work too hard. If you think Guile is gonna throw a boom after he's definitely pushed himself out of other footsie range, Stomp. See what happens. Because most of the time, that Stomp is enough to give you the pushback to control the position you're at. The key is to recognize when Guile has pushed himself too far to actually hit you again. One of those things you really have to learn to watch for. How many times has he hit a button, and did he or did he not walk forward between those buttons? If you find yourself just being pummeled, this is especially true at lower levels where the Guile player is just pressing buttons to keep control, you can definitely Stomp. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar enough with Necalli to know which Stomp, but there are slightly different ranges, and therefore I'm really confident that our Necalli player knows which Stomp to use. It's kind of sad to get hit by boom when you do EX Stomp, because that can happen, but it still saves you a lot of trouble because of the way that the moves interact from there. And Guile doesn't offer you a lot of other movements. You're constantly having to watch out for the jump the same way you constantly have to watch out for the jump against Karin, and therefore the Stomp is a good way of making sure that you don't have to worry about it as much. This is another situation though, where technically you can use the V-reversal to get out of many situations, because unlike the Ed matchup, you actually don't need it for anything. You don't need the V trigger in this matchup. It doesn't save you from Guile setups. Guile will just walk away from you and resolve the problem in his own way. So you don't gain that much by activating it. It's good for a cancel if you have enough meter to do explosive damage, but most of the time Guile has poked at you for so long that there's not much chance of that either. There we go, another mild hesitation on it. The reason the EX Stomp helps even more is because if the opponent does jump, but you were doing EX Stomp at the time, especially in the corner, you generally won't get hit by the jump and you'll end up being out of the corner, which is what you mostly care about. That was perfectly done. This, on the other hand, isn't a space where you do too much. You basically let Guile spend all the meter on it. which means that it was the perfect moment to activate that because it gets you out of so many situations. But that right there was the EX Stomp spot. I'm not sure if the wolf missed the execution, but that would have been helpful in that space. Going for super would have probably failed because I think Guile could just counter with his own. But the EX Stomp would get you through enough that Guile would at least have to make the decision, and if he happened to jump, then you'd probably be out of the corner. But regardless of what character Mallow chooses, assuming they're still playing, our Karine will probably see if she can remember to choose her V-skill too, and see what it makes available. There's not a lot that it helps with if you're not familiar with it. It isn't like other characters where you get to hit this button in neutral all of the time, and it didn't affect anything else. This is one of the difficulties of learning certain characters at certain tiers. If you choose their V-skill 1 normally, and it's part of either your combos or your spacing, you're still going to automatically hit it when you need that spacing change, and obviously the move is now different. Well, we have Oro, which is basically the same, yeah. It's a little harder to deal with Oro's projectiles using this move, but on the other hand, it's actually a really good move against Oro as a generality because it doesn't push Karine too far forward. It does that thing of we're wiggling around in nearly perfect footsie range. I'm just going to hit this because it's not going to extend my status too much. But generally, she won't be able to use it against this as easily as you'd expect. Fortunately, she has lots of ways around that move, and he takes so long to do it that I believe her training with Orobot, while not complete, will probably give her at least some confidence in trying certain ways around the ball. This moment right here, for example, is difficult to choose to use it in, but you see, that sort of thing matters a lot. The speed of the move, relative to the extension of the move, tend to throw off the opponent a little bit. But I find that that particular V skill isn't so great against Karine because unless you've controlled where Karine is standing and are using it as a pressure tool, she's probably going to get around it. She has a lot of good options for getting around it. And since her V skill is chargeable, you can't actually be sure whether or not it's time to do anything or trying to get around it. It also you spend a lot of time distracted by the potential of the move and let her hit other moves, which is usually bad for you. Simply put though, it gets her to V-trigger faster, and once she's at V-trigger, life is a little easier regardless. Most of Oro's longer setups don't work once her V-trigger is active, and he doesn't really get much out of the empty jump of it either, so there's not much you can do there. That, for example, is a matter of that move is kind of hard to react to sometimes, so probably it wasn't going to get parried, and I believe she might also just know that if you do parry it, you don't necessarily gain that much from doing so. Therefore, you see it's the same sorts of things here that Ed makes available, but Oro isn't quite as good at them. Oro can dash up and do this crouch medium kick, but the rest of the threat of that match up is not here, so there is some benefit to still being able to just go, well, I can just block because you're Oro and I don't have to care as much. Oof, so close, and still managed to get out of the block position. But this time, the dash at medium kick once again comes in for the kill? No, not kill. That was really gutsy to do there against her. Karine can in fact kill you from there, and it's very difficult to execute the kill, but she can totally do it. That said, you can see how Maokin in the same spaces would definitely not help, because the Maokin is too likely to hit and therefore cause the result we don't want. For those of you who don't understand what she's supposed to do in reaction to that move, when you see Oro start the ball, if you think, I've noted this really early, you just empty Seppo, because you don't actually care. Once you're closer to him, he takes so long to do the move properly that it doesn't matter. You can empty Seppo simply because you will probably block the ball, and then you will probably be able to block whatever follows as well. It is also one of those good mental option selects where if you have that reaction but you're too close, you can convert into Orochi at closer ranges and therefore get away with it. This is especially true if you misstepped and went for it when it wasn't time yet, as possibly just happened, because he can deal with Orochi and definitely mess with you, but if you were spaced correctly to begin with, it's much less likely that will go quite that way. And there you see in action why that sort of move is so important. The key thing there was that Karin did not move forward until things were happening. This is a hard situation because it's hard to accept that even in that moment that you've still won the match. It's not a thing that you can easily learn to do. Because you are within a range where your opponent can hit you once and kill you. Therefore, the obvious response is, well, obviously I haven't won the match, my life lead isn't even enough to save me from one combo. But the fact that your opponent is in that state too and can't really risk certain things means that you probably should still play from the very, very relaxed state. Mainly because playing from the tense sore state or the I'm going to try to get in and win state doesn't actually lead to you winning most of the time. It's mostly an illusion. I would say that's anecdotal, but it's a thing that pro players will often tell you. You did the thing and sometimes it wins and you remember those times when it did make you win, but you just end up frustrated all the times it didn't, but you don't necessarily remember that you could have lost the other way and possibly gotten more experience with losing in that way. But we are now to the point of, I believe this player is another that we've seen recently and is generally quite strong. Their style doesn't appear strong at first, and I can't be absolutely sure that they aren't technically more so strong against the style that our team uses, but I guess I'm about to have that demonstrated or not. In general though, my familiarity with this player is that they have a mastery of their Ryu flow that makes it difficult to catch them off guard. And if you can't catch a Ryu player off guard, you can't really do a lot. Probably why Daigo was so successful with the character back when Ryu was super strong, and I think might be there again. I haven't actually been keeping too much track of what Daigo is doing these days.
Round one.
It comes mostly from their sheer willingness to just be Ryu. One of the hardest things people face in this game when you play a simple or basic character is seeing all the cool shiny stuff that other people get to do and wanting to do those things, and then throwing yourself under the bus somewhat by your character not being able to do them. But this player does not generally come into that situation much. They play Ryu and that's it.
Round two. Fight.
Oh, I am really tired of looking at training stage. I just realized how tired I am of looking at training stage. Here's a good example of that situation. Technically, another person might have decided, I really want to do something about this fact, but Nikita was already winning. Technically, blatantly winning, and really didn't need to do much. Could just stay there and, you know, win. And being able to make that decision as a core concept of what you're doing is especially important when you're playing a character like Ryu. Similarly, being willing to just go, I don't really care if I lose, I know what to do here, and it might just not work. I wouldn't necessarily call it a skill, because again, it's mostly psychological, but you do have to be able to do it. To accept, this has less than 100% chance of working, definitely. And I don't have any other great options, so I'm probably going to do it anyway. But you can see here the little pauses, the little moments of, okay, my flow is ready now. And very, very little overcommitment to any specific thing that's happening. The flexibility of the mind here is quite a lot. I would almost guess that they shifted there simply because they recognized, I'm too stressed, I'm going to drop this combo and then die. So let me just see if I can kill on the mix-up after it. But of course, I'm not in their mind, so I can't be sure. I definitely know I've had that moment myself of having to make the bet that the opponent will somehow get killed by the usually Sinenshu, honestly. Which isn't the greatest option for this purpose, but it can definitely help. But that is also a good segue into what this stream is technically about. The more you can save yourself time mentally for anything, the better you'll do. And this player is almost perfectly an example of that. They do definitely seem to have that aura of someone who is not thinking past the last thing they did. They're not necessarily thinking all that hard about the last thing they did either. The sort of person who can uppercut on wake up, get punished, and go, that was fine, and just let go of it and start focusing on the next thing that happens. The main problem is that opponents of players like this often end up so stressed out that it's hard to tell what exactly is happening. And if you're particularly good at getting into your opponent's head, you've probably experienced this, where your opponent's decision-making seems to just kind of break down. But if you're not the sort of person who has long-term plans, then this normally doesn't matter. You still play the same way, and sometimes they kill you, and then sometimes you go, oh, well, they killed me. But putting too much stock into trying to figure out why they killed you, when you know you've already reached that point, is probably not the best plan. This was a rough match for DeWolf on the stream before last, I think? I don't remember for sure. And you can easily see why. DeWolf has a lot of growing to do in this very specific aspect of fighting games. How do I make sure that my opponent cannot throw me off balance? Because mostly what happens is that he just kind of stops.
Round one.
But this is explicitly a thing he's been working on, and KOF having come out tends to help with it. Your opponent playing a very basic Ryu offers a lot more options for Nakali to do things as a generality, which is good. You don't have to worry so much about crazy things happening to you midway. And you can focus a lot more on recognizing what is actually happening. And not worrying that there's some setup that you've never seen before. That said, you still have to kind of let go, because getting too caught up in what Ryu might do is bad. Similarly, trying to make sure you land your hits is not going to get you very far. But we do see that Dwarf is already shifting in that way, not necessarily pursuing the crawling beast all that hard, for example, not necessarily trying to make sure that an advantage situation actually turns into a damage benefit. And that's probably helping quite a lot, as, again, Ryu has good damage, Ryu has definite strong options against a lot of things, but Nakali is a hard character to overwhelm entirely, especially when you have the capacity to put the torrent of power in front of you. In fact, getting a lot of distance here is Ryu's probable best option. You're kinda hoping that it wears out before you do anything. Still, one of the bigger problems in this matchup is that Ryu uses meter a lot more freely than Nakali can. It is a core skill almost for a Nakali player to be able to convert into super, simply because against many opponents this is where Nakali ends up. Getting close is difficult, doing specials that actually make a difference is difficult, and your big goal, your big payoff is, I have super, now what are you going to do? Or, I have super and I'm going to like dash up and crouch medium kick you to death. Those things are pretty important to learn as core skills for this character in the long term. In the short term, there's not really a lot to say about this specific matchup. They are basically the two most vanilla characters in the game, even with all of their buffs. We've often said that Nakali probably was more so meant to be the Ryu of this game, because if you don't know how to zone, you're not really gaining a lot by playing Ryu. And it is quite possible, because there are lots of other games that come out, 3D gamers for example, coming to this one, wouldn't necessarily have an innate understanding of how to play Ryu as a whole. But the way Nakali's options work, it's a little clearer. You could manage to come from say Tekken and play Nakali decently, if you understood enough about how Street Fighter worked, as a general thing. So, a lot of people were looking for Ryu to be that base character, and ended up getting technically a half-naked Dreadlock VMAT. But of course, Nakali was never really pitched to players as that, despite him being pretty good at it, so I can't be certain that that was Capcom's intent at all, and even if it was, they didn't push on it that I saw.
Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
one of the absolute core skills you need, especially as a footsie character against a person who is this much Ryu. Get really into the habit of neutral jumping their projectiles, because Ryu will back out of footsie range against most of these characters because it's too much of an even match when you're in footsie range. He doesn't have as many advantages as he would probably want to have if he was in footsie range instead. So there is at least one point where, since the player wants to get into footsie range because they're the footsie character, Ryu benefits from being able to back off and throw the fireball and hit them with the fireball. But if you block the fireball, that is what Ryu wants. There's pushback involved, there's spacing involved, there's timing involved, there's all sorts of things you get as the Ryu player out of making someone block a fireball that you definitely don't get if they neutral jump it. You'll notice, for example, that our Ryu, and when that happens, you don't care either. If you land on a fireball, 90% of the time you don't care. Ryu does not, in general, have or know a good meaty from that perspective, from that happening. The best Ryu in the world probably have something, but they can't keep perfect track of when you jumped and how you landed on it. So it's more so in your favor to even land on the projectile than it is to block it. If you have the health to get through it, and you'll notice, for example, that our Ryu player has mostly, when not in footsie range, they just hung out. They don't do anything because they can't just throw more projectiles, and they don't have a character that can just do a random bunch of moves. In fact, backing off when the situation doesn't suit you, to then get them to throw the fireball, which you then neutral jump and then reset the situation, is super important. This is something you notice against Sagat as well, although with Sagat it's more so that you get out of Sagat's range and then jump. But your jump isn't intended to hit Sagat with the jump. Your jump is specifically intended to make Sagat to get into a range where you could deal with Tiger, you could deal with Sagat's neutral, whereas you couldn't before. You wanted to get to that space, but you couldn't get there by walking, and you couldn't get there by jumping because you would jump too close. So you instead back off and then jump into position. Similarly here, you back off and then dash into position, and the situation slowly favors you. The amount of times you can reset your own emotional state here is quite high. It's really one of the most chill matches you could face if you are not playing someone like Poison who actually needs to attack Ryu from here. Just take the space he gives you when he backdashes or whatever if you want it, and if you don't want it, don't worry about it. That I did not expect to land, but even in this scenario, the fact that that happened isn't necessarily much of a negative for the Korean player. Yes, she is down, but she's down a lot. It's not that big a deal. She is a very explosive character, even without too much meter, and could just activate V-Trigger anyway. V-Trigger also gives you the higher advantage of being able to guess at whether or not you should try to actually Rasenha against a fireball that is thrown.
You lose.
Most of the time this isn't great because the Rasenha actually takes so long to get there that Ryu, I think, can often get away, but the threat of it also increases your effectiveness a lot, because Ryu can't then throw fireballs to stop you from dashing, at least not as easily. So you can definitely get something out of taking all of this time that you get out of fighting this character type at this range to take stock of your options, to double check whether or not it's a good idea to do one thing or another, to check your meter, to verify that what you want to happen is actually happening in terms of health, and so on. And of course, just do things that sometimes confuse your opponent. But here we have already active, and that is going to take a while to go down. I'm not really sure what she was doing there. But it's the same thing overall. The flow of the match changes a lot when you have control of that type. The Ryu player is doing the same thing, and for them it's just part of the style most of the time. The backdash or whatever, they're not committed to that, they're breathing. Unfortunately, I think our Kareen is not used to dashing up and doing nothing, and therefore it's a little bit rough because she ends up hitting like sweep. You can dash up and do all sorts of weird things if you really want to. None of them are going to be particularly more effective than any other, which is hard to get used to. The idea that, oh, I dashed, I didn't gain much, I should do what? I'm not sure. Well, don't care. That situation, for example, would probably have been better if she had recognized, oh, I've been at V trigger for the longest time, I could have just like done this instead. This, for example, is also a critical moment. Kareen wins this by doing that. You can't jump necessarily. He could try neutral jumping but might get anti-aired. The amount of things he has to think about is drastically higher than the amount of things she has to think about in that moment. And even stuff like that, I'm going to dash up and block your neutral jump attack. Her dash is quite fast. There are benefits to this sort of thing. Double shimmied. And outspaced slightly. But this is a reset. Once again, you can dash, you can chill, and then eventually you stress your opponent a little bit more. Stressing them more while letting your own stress reduce is really optimal.
You win. It's go time. Let's do this.
I'm sure most serious Street Fighter players who spend a lot of time in battle lounges have by now realized that, yeah, the ping bars don't necessarily mean the connection quality is going to lead to you not being able to do things. To me, I'm not even noticing any dip there, but I'm not sure whether or not their stuff got worse in some direction on their end. I think it's normally fine though. We are back to the harder version of this, the V-Skill 1 versus Ed. But that's another thing that one builds up over time. If you've normally practiced with one, you just automatically click in at that screen. And unfortunately, you can't really do much about it.
Round one. Fight.
One of the main reasons why this becomes a problem for Kareen in the long term is similar to what happens when she's fighting Birdie. When you're fighting Birdie on Kareen, one of the things you can do that you can't usually get away with other characters is to just Rasenha in neutral, because you're trying to hit with the very tip of the Rasenha, but Ed will just do that, and Ed will do that well enough and consistently enough that you're not likely to come out on top from doing it, except in one situation. If you manage to do it after a perfectly spaced Mayoken. The problem is that Ed is not going to give you time to do a perfectly spaced Mayoken. You can break down this sort of scenario though. If I can't Mayoken, why is that? And if you figure out why it is that you can't Mayoken, then you probably will find a different path through the situation. The reason why Kareen can't Mayoken is because at the end of that situation where they are in position, Mayoken is the only thing that works, more or less, and Ed can benefit from jumping. So, it breaks down to the same binary sort of coin flip that we've taught people to analyze before. If you can't do one move, because your opponent will do something, counter the something. When you find yourself thinking, Mayoken time or Mayoken spacing, try your best to rewire yourself to go, oh, that means that my opponent's best option is to jump, because here I would Mayoken, and because I would Mayoken, they have to jump. And because they have to jump, I should be ready to anti-air that jump, and that will be my way of getting through the situation. As noted, Ed is relatively messed up by the light Rasenha, but again, it's a part of a whole process. You have to get Ed to the point where he thinks it's time to move. Otherwise, he'll just block it and you'll die, right? So now we've got this moment where, aha, I have stopped you from doing things because now you're waiting for me to do light Rasenha. But the easy thing to remember here is, why were you doing this to begin with? Why were you worried? You wanted to light Rasenha because of spacing, because you wanted something out of the spacing. If your opponent refuses to let the light Rasenha happen, then probably you gained something from that, because the light Rasenha was not your first choice. You had to do it because of something else that was happening. Once you've determined, you're stopping me from doing X, so I have to light Rasenha, try not to forget what the something you were doing or wanted to do was. And that is probably the key to working out your full strategies. If you remember the links between different things you want to do, it'll make your life a lot easier. Here, we're doing light Rasenha because if light Rasenha is not done, Ed will move too fast and get into Karina's space before she can do things. Karina's quite content to just walk forward because Ed's buttons don't reach all that far. That was what we started with. Ed can hit buttons, but none of them are going to drift him forward without being telegraphed or so on. So she has a lot of space to play footsies in the exact way she wants to, except, you know, if he decides to just EX uppercut. And even then, sometimes he'll get messed up for doing it. That means that Ed's play often involves moving, and he moves so quickly that the situation doesn't get good for Karine, or he uses the various things for the skill, and that will happen. But your position, the situation is still benefiting you, because if you have got Ed to the point where he's willing to spend time doing upward B skill, then you have other benefits. This is another situation, for example, where building up an entire strategy would have you have a direct plan. If Ed is at this point, then what you need is V reversal, because you get to reset the situation and get him off you instead of the situation going back in his favor a lot. So basically, she could just walk up to this player now, and mostly that's the threat she faces off with. Ed isn't terribly strong against V reversals. He doesn't have good V reversal throw setups. He's similar to Hondo, where you can just go, you know what, I don't feel like having you here, so I'm going to push you off now. And so on down the line. But that presence of mind, that ability to more or less release all your general thoughts and rely just on your plan, which you then have to practice a lot, is where this sort of thing comes from. The practice itself is fun if you find someone who's willing to fight you seriously and not run away. And clearly, Mallow is not going to just run away. Mallow will adapt around every adaptation made, making it easier and easier to gain something from fighting and learn. Looks like someone's AFK, but for now, we are getting close to the end of the stream. And with a stream this intense, probably, I wouldn't necessarily assume it's going to close up immediately, but it probably is not going to last all that long. But that said, if you were in any way camera shy, but still wanted to play, then you can jump on in anytime. This is, again, a 3 rounds first to 2 character select on lobby. And generally we expect that if you are anywhere on the Atlantic Rim, you will probably have a good enough connection. The lounge at the moment seems to be biased toward the Caribbean and South and Central America somewhat. So bear that in mind. If you generally have poor connections to that area, you might not want to jump in. But so far, as you can see, everything's going well on our end.
Round 1.
Our team are mostly at the point of the game where you can't really get that much more out of it without this sort of thing. Building up your plans, building up your strategies, remembering your matchups. That's what fighting games become after a while. And if you feel as if you're not there yet, then I have some bots to sell you. They're free. Or technically you have to pay for your own internet, I guess. You can find all of our various Street Fighter V practice bots, our most effective bots, simply because of how Street Fighter V works, at our website 2-mk.org. You can find them under the simply bots if you go straight there, but the navigation is built by a professional web developer, so you should probably be able to get through. If you're not interested in this game, but for some reason are still here on a Monday, there are some bots for other games, though in general they're not as helpful because Street Fighter is the only game we have so far that actually saves the bots and saves them per character. Everything else you have to figure out how to input, but fortunately everything else is more or less an, let's call it anime-ish game. Certainly enough of one that the specifics of how their combos are done, how their pressure and tricks are done, have more to do with what buttons you press, and with my experience with building the Street Fighter ones, I was able to make some stuff that you could probably manage to put in if you have a reasonably long training session in mind, where that's like 45 minutes or something. It would take you 10 minutes to put in the bot at least. Even a half-hour training session is probably still worth it if your execution is enough, and sometimes the bot not being input correctly fully is still a good way to learn something new. Fortunately, KOF seems to be on that list as noted.
You win.
But we haven't really been having much success with the carrying over. By that I mean, in games like Under Night and we've learned Melty Blood, if you input one set of recorded inputs, what we call a bot, and change character, the new character will use those same inputs. This isn't always helpful, but it does sometimes have some benefits. For example, you don't have to input all of them, you might only need to change one when changing character, or in some cases you don't need to at all. There's like 2 or 3 characters that are completely effective choosing to use the same bot type input. So far, we haven't had that sort of luck with KOF, and this is because of KOF's overall design. While the characters' moves tend to be somewhat universal in certain ways, their specials are usually very unique to them, and meant to be used in very specific ways. So we are in the position of Street Fighter style information overload, but with bots that don't save between uses of the game, don't save per character, and also don't carry over well between characters. With a cast of 39 though, it probably isn't going to be that bad. We should be able to find at least some overlap. Unfortunately, what we've noted is that a lot of the time you'd actually be doing yourself a disservice if you were to try to go, well, here's our Athena bot, please try to use this with other characters and see what happens. Because their normal attacks are also usually a bit more specialized, given that there are only 4 of them. So we'll continue working on that and see what we can come up with. There's a lot of stuff in KOF that can be practiced this way. And unlike the anime style games, as I said before, where your defense is often universal and even understanding your opponent's mix-ups mostly is a matter of, well, should I do this invincible thing, this high-low defense thing, or get out of the way? KOF isn't quite that. There's a lot more complexity, and therefore a lot of the time you have to learn that complexity closer to the frame data level rather than the move choice or spacing level. And therefore we're probably going to have to come up with at least some bots. So wish us luck with that. Hopefully it will not be too taxing or terrible, and therefore we'll be able to start providing them within the next week or two. Well, this has gone on for a while, and I think that means that this is in fact the last on-stream match of the night. The lounge, as mentioned, will probably close fairly soon, mainly because it's been mostly intense, and I'm not sure that the players who are making it that intense are actually going to stay. Still, with our actual current team members here down to 2, it turning into just them fighting each other is probably not what we had in mind for the night as a whole. There is a chance though that the wolf is going to end up staying around, and you can look for a lounge with that name. This is particularly true if the others have already left. But my voice seems to be going, and as I noted at the beginning of the stream, I am actually sick, so apologies if it's been difficult to understand me, or I've been too quiet, or any of those things. Hopefully it didn't really ruin your experience of the stream itself, since even if I can't be easily understood, a lot of what's going on is somewhat self-explanatory if you can just pick up a few things I'm saying. And our Karina and Nikali have basically decided to drag this out almost as much as possible. Now all we need is for it to go down to like last health bar pixel. See, yeah, they're the type. Don't double KO now, guys. And with that, this has been Rillian 14 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.